Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to talk for just a minute here about Chapter 12, Mass Casualties and Mass Evacuation. There's a PowerPoint on the course site that was done by one of the previous students in the classes, and that's also the case with several of the PowerPoints. We just did the class a little bit different than we are doing it this semester. But anyway, so go through that PowerPoint, and also certainly you want to read through the text as well. But I just kind of wanted to hit some of the highlights of this chapter to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about it. Mass casualties and mass evacuation, not something that we really want to think about or talk about, but they do occur. Events such as that of September 11th, but also more so from natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, situations like that. Um, we have to deal with those, and it's important that we deal with those properly. And I think that one of the biggest pieces that I get out of this is that it's really important to have these large scale drills in your community with your local healthcare providers, with your local law enforcement, so that and all other aspects of that are involved, so that everybody is on the same page about what needs to happen, and so that it's orderly, it's uh, it's a process, it's successful, and no one gets left behind. So your book brings up different situations where um, there might be mass casualties. It talks about those first, and then the mass evacuation secondly. Um, Hazardous materials incidents, natural disasters, transportation issues, civil disturbances, though all of those kinds of things. And each one of those creates or presents a different type of situation to deal with. Civil disturbances, we may not be able to do anything until the disturbance is quieted or at least under control. Law enforcement, EMS become targets, as well as fire. Um, Hazardous materials, it may be a situation of identification of the product. It may be thinking about decontamination. There's just a lot of different situations. There is some on page 303 in your book where it discusses the mass casualty priorities. Of course, triage, treatment, and transport are the three T's that we want to remember. Triage is very important, and those, boy, that's tough. That is a tough decision. Um, Certainly for those, it's not so tough for those that have already passed away or those that are the walking wounded, but for those that are hanging in the balance, it can be a really tough situation. Triage is the first thing that has to happen. Nobody leaves until triage is done. And then on scene treatment if possible, and then of course transportation. Um, how that needs to be organized and handled through the incident command system, the medical branch, and how it functions has to be set up properly so that it is an orderly process. And I think that's a very important aspect of it. Page 306 in your book has that piece of the EMS branch organization that shows the medical branch and the triage, the treatment, the transport, and the morgue group as well. So all of those aspects are very important. Having that medical supply officer, having supervisors for each of those. The book even mentions making sure that like your transport, it's kind of a drive-by or a drive-through, I guess I should say, not a drive-by, but that type of a situation so that it flows properly. Many of you, especially those of you that are involved with EMS, have had training on these types of incidents and perhaps participated in drills that involved mass casualties, and you may even have experience with the real life thing. For your sake, I hope not. Um, So, of course, search and rescue is one of our big priorities. Incident stabilization is the second. If those two things can happen simultaneously, that's great. Sometimes we may not have enough people to do that. So, when we mentioned triage tags, and I believe that just recently they've come out with a standardized system of colors and tagging, um, because it varied, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and those have been established. Triage, of course, means to sort and to try to get people in the right direction. Um, when we're thinking about the walking wounded, and depending upon where this happens, your hospitals or emergency care facilities may become secondary triage locations. Basically, if people can get themselves to a medical facility, they're going to do that. Then you have concerns about contamination. Again, making sure that people are decontaminated so they don't contaminate the whole medical facility. So there's just a lot of people that have to be on board and that have to be a part of this planning process when we're talking about a mass casualty incident. Um, think about a school bus accident or incident, um, for that can create a mass casualty um, incident in communities. If a school bus is loaded with children, um, there's other, we think of, major incidents, but again, keep in mind that that disaster is what overtaxes the resources in the community. And for some communities, that's not a lot. So we have to make sure that we remember that and that we're prepared for those things that happen, that we coordinate with our hospital. Medical communications, making sure that we have the ability to communicate with the hospital. Again, the book's a little bit older, and now cell phones and other internet type of resources are available. We need to make sure that we know how to work those, and we know how to use those and operate those, and can use them successfully. The medical assistance teams, this is something that since some of the earlier disasters have come around, that in the federal government, FEMA, has organized some of these. We may have them in your own communities. Medical assistance teams, these are doctors, nurses, others that volunteer their time to be a part of this team, um, and they can be called up at any time. There's also a national disaster medical system, the DMATs, that are available. Again, that's that federal system. People volunteer for those, and they can be called up. So um, it's a coordinated system, and so there's lots of assistance out there to those smaller communities when this happens. But as in any emergency like that, um, unless they have already been um, called up prior to the actual incident happening, such as when you have prior knowledge, like a hurricane or a weather incident of some kind. It's going to take time for them to get to you. So you have to remember that we have to be prepared. We have to do that piece: triage, treatment, and transport. There's so much to think about when we are looking at that from a medical standpoint as well. Um, when we have multiple fatality incidents, again, think about 9/11, and your book gives some great tips to think about, of not moving people, of not removing people, not removing personal belongings, not moving furniture if necessary, or unless it's necessary, so that identification is possible. There you have to have the coordination with the coroner or the medical examiner. Those are usually high-ranking officials in your community. With some of them may have different roles and responsibilities in each community, but they are in charge of that morgue, or the people, the bodies in that morgue. And identification is huge for these types of incidents. So making sure that we have a way to set up a temporary morgue, perhaps on site. Again, decontamination. You have to think about that for these bodies. So there's so much to think about when we have this mass casualty incident, and having that plan in place, bringing all the players to the table. Um, I think that's the important piece is everybody has to recognize their role in this type of an incident and everybody come together. I think it's important to train together. It's important to drill, have those large scale disaster drills in the community so that they people know what is expected of them and there's no surprises along the way. Even making sure we have the proper equipment. Um, that we can set up temporary morgues or temporary decontamination centers or facilities. All of that is very, very important. Mass evacuation is a different concern. We have mass evacuation so we don't have mass casualties. That would be the goal. But that again is not easily done. Boy, trying to get the people out and trying to get people to listen to instructions. We have people that want to go, people that don't want to go. People, it's just really, really difficult. We saw that with Katrina and the situation there. I think sometimes natural events are probably where we have some kind of prior notice. Hurricane Matthew that recently came to the Georgia coast. Um, the first time that I-16 had been on contraflow traffic. That was a test. I don't. I've not been able to participate in any of the after action type of reports, but I know that some places got hit harder. I don't know the success of the contraflow, how that worked. Um, I need to do some follow up. Maybe I'll try to find some of that information and post it on the course site. There's a lot of different types of considerations for mass evacuation, defending in place, who calls for evacuation. Those things have to be decided ahead of time. You can't, no freelancing allowed, and they have to be decided so that somebody knows. I think that this is a place where we can certainly encourage preparation for evacuation among our community members, making sure they have an evacuation plan, they know what the routes are, they have an evacuation kit, a plan of notifying people, their family members or who else, where they're going, where they're going to be evacuated to. Um, are they leaving town? Are they able to leave town? Under what circumstances can they leave or not leave? How are they going to be evacuated? We have to think about, you know, these things never happen at convenient times. So we have to think about schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and even jails. How are we going to transport these individuals? And what are we going to do with them? Where are we going to put them? How about shelters? What kind of arrangements do you have in your community for shelters? And one of the big things I know that came out of Katrina was pets and making sure that pets and families can evacuate together. That's always the best way for everyone involved. But again, there's a nice little mathematical equation that's brought out on pages 322 and 323 of your book that talks about the whole time involved, the time delays, the time required to notify, the time required for people to start moving, and the time required to leave the affected area. So all of that equals your evacuation time. And some people are just not going to leave. And you don't write them off. That's not what I'm trying to say, but you cannot stay with them. I think that we saw that on Tybee Island during Hurricane Matthew, several people just, they weren't leaving, and the emergency responders were the last ones out, and they're like, no, we're not staying. We're leaving. It presented issues for water supply and water stations that were, or lift stations that were non-functional after the hurricane came through. Just a lot of different considerations that you have to have about infrastructure and other types of areas. So and people getting back in, they want to see the damage. What? And I don't blame them. They want to see what's wrong with their home. They want to see if they still have a home. But how long do you wait for reentry? How, do you let people reenter? How do you know that it is the right thing? These are the things I believe that are so imperative for communities to work together to plan. You have to identify gaps. Do we have enough shelters for our community? Um, if we're going to be a shelter for another community, I know here in where we are in Swainsboro, the recreation center was a shelter for a Hurricane Matthew. I don't know how many people were there, but there was problems because people didn't have a way to get home or they didn't have a home to go to anymore. So many issues. This is where states, local jurisdictions, and then states, and then the federal government provides assistance. But in the meantime, we have to make sure that people's needs are being met, that whole concept of safety and security, their emotional needs are being taken care of. It's just really, it's a traumatic time and a traumatic event for everyone. But making sure that we have a plan and that we practice that plan so that these gaps are identified prior to an actual event occurring. I think that that's a real important piece of it. We don't like to think about this. Again, the things that we can do to help people that live in even these low-lying areas. Be prepared for evacuation. If you have to evacuate, this is what you need to take with you. You need to have this together. We need you to be ready. And some of the tips that we can provide people, knowing how we're going to communicate with people. Social media. Is it whether it's over the television, the radio. How do people get their information? So much is involved in this whole process. Planning is very, very important. What it's going to do is minimize the deaths and injuries when we talk about the evacuation piece, but also even in our casualty, our triage treatment and transport with our casualties, making sure we decontaminate, making sure we're prepared for all different kinds of incidents. We have to prepare for everything. So some excellent information in this chapter that follows our chapter on Homeland Security issues and then terrorism, and then this whole mass casualty, mass evacuation piece lends us to a lot of food for thought. So I hope that you are thinking about your own community and what your role is in that disaster, but more so, what is your role in that disaster planning piece? If you work at a hospital, that what is the hospital's role? If you work at a college, what's the college's role? And if you work in those emergency services, what role do you play in this process? So that's chapter 12. Be sure and look at the PowerPoint. Be sure and read. And I thank you very much for your attention. Have a great day.